I think Western education sucks.
Let's talk about that.
No, I don't
now.
actually want to talk about that.
I'm just
There
joking.
is just an element. I was talking with a guy at work who...
You actually talk to people at work, huh?
Well, yeah, I'm debating on whether or not I should say... no one's going to find out.
What?
There are two things that when people do them, you'd probably be wise to think they probably want to keep doing that and not stop doing it to talk to me about it. And I would say if someone's wearing headphones or reading a book, those are two activities that they are very likely not to react well to you interrupting to talk about it. So it's like if you see someone on their lunch break reading a book, I think you should think that the very lowest thing on their thought list right at that moment is they want to talk about the book they're reading. It's like, no, actually, what we want to do is read the book we're reading. But anyways, he was asking about books, and so it's like he's noticed for the past several weeks that I read a lot of philosophy books, and so we had a discussion. It wasn't like it wasn't like, oh gosh, please stop talking to me, because at least it was about something, which I can appreciate. But I'm still like, I got 10 minutes of my lunch, I'd rather not waste them. I'll be happy to talk. I'll be wasting my work hours, not my lunch hours. But anyways, he was talking about like he went to a Catholic school and actually read meditations in Latin, and I was like, I wish I had done that. And then even in the conversation, I was like, I'm sure at the time I would have hated it because me now would have appreciated it. I back then would not have. But even still, I'm like, someone should have made me do it. There are things that I'm like, yeah, your kids will hate you until they grow up. And I'm perfectly content to be that kind of parent where it's like, yeah, but
There's also a part of me that goes,
what? You're now like part of the 3% of people who actually know what any of the crap we're talking about in the West.
Well, it's like...
Why the heck was this stuff not addressed
That's
in
the question, I suppose.
Well, the school system or
I'm saying right now, taking advantage of like you could learn Latin and Greek.
Yeah, but the problem is I don't spend 8 hours a day at an institution where I could do that.
Well, sure.
It's like I now have
take us long.
I have to now do it in my own time with my own resources, which are both limited. Whereas back then, it's like I had nothing to do all day but listen to what people had felt they needed to
Latin,
tell me.
I know nothing about. Greek, I at least have enough to.
See, I am curious.
dangerous.
What would you rate your knowledge of Latin, or I guess of both? But
Greek
you had
is
more
better.
study of Greek. But what would what's your percentage scale of like?
As far as understanding, when I'm reading, Greek, I would
reading
say,
is best because neither. Well, I mean, obviously Greek is still a language, but ancient Greek is not spoken anymore.
Greek, I would say maybe 40%.
That's more than I would have guessed.
Latin, I would say I
wouldn't say
maybe,
40. I'd say
maybe,
Latin's probably 20 feels generous even for Latin.
I'm not like Latin for me. I know nothing in Latin hardly.
I am.
I mean, we did some, but mainly only translating from Greek. So it's like, okay. Oddly enough, though, the Hebrew was not as used as you might think.
See, that's a shame. Because if you were actually... Some of my favorite elements of the Exodus series, which I've been listening to as it comes out. So, first, funnily enough, I knew of Dennis Prager. I didn't know anything about him, I guess, other than like, oh yeah, he has his own online university.
I don't know that I can get my head around.
He's like a total Jewish historian.
Yeah. Who
speaks, and I mean, he's obviously is Jewish, so I mean, he is both a Jewish historian and a Jewish historian. But it's like, he's all the time in the thing. He even said at the beginning, it's like, oh, I won't be, spouting Hebrew too much. And then throughout the course of the thing, he's like, well, now it's interesting because the Hebrew in this context. And I was like, I find that fascinating. Why don't we know more about this language?
Yeah, people do. I didn't,
obviously, but it's like, why didn't you have to?
I didn't dedicate more of my study to that sphere. If I was a Old Testament theologian, I probably would have, but I'm not.
Well, I guess that's no doubt their very reason.
I have recently come to appreciate the Old Testament more than I had in the past. I would say it that way.
See, I feel like I've always felt it was oddly curtailed.
What, the Old Testament?
It was oddly pushed to the side.
Oh, that's certainly
true. Whereas it's like, Jesus would have believed it, and some 100%. Of the apostles.
Yep.
So, like, we can't just be like, You don't matter. You're in the back.
Well, it's funny because it's a problem within the.
Very Protestant.
And I was about to say, within the Protestant community, it's very much a problem.
It's like, well, if we can
we don't need that
we can just
anymore.
get rid of spoken tradition. Let's just get rid of all of this spoken tradition. Because that's mostly what it would have been.
Well, you see, it's written down, and God said.
Did you ever listen to that video?
God said that He actually put all this together and ratified. We're going to push it away.
Did you ever get the Lutheran satire video I sent you about the Reformation?
I did.
Because everything I've learned about Luther, I'm like, he'd have been like mega Catholic by today's standards.
I've always asserted that his intention was never to start his own thing.
I mean, everyone would know that, but it's like...
I don't know that I quite agreed with their... They're obviously making it far more
joking about the other post-Lutheran Reformationists. I don't know what you'd call them.
I did...
They call them the Protestant...
Proto-Reformation.
What do they call them? Like coat-tailers or something, like basically people who followed on Luther's...
I would say I agree with that sentiment. Certainly once he opened the door, everybody was like, yeah, who needs them? And it was like, okay, it's like, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. But then everybody ran with it. I don't think...
Well, because it's like Luther believes a lot of the things I think Protestants discard. And I'm like, okay,
I don't
but even
think
the guy
that it fell that blasé fair. I don't think it was like...
Well, obviously it didn't happen the way they portrayed it.
Like, it was a little bit like,
it's a 4-minute joke video, but I'm saying the fact that he's going, no, Luther still held all these tenets which modern Protestants deny, and I'm like...
Well, no, that says it right there in Scripture.
That's a problem.
Yeah, but we don't believe that.
Because we're saying, well, we believe in the concept... Even if you do take it like, well, yeah, sure, we believe in sola scriptura and we don't believe in the magisterium and whatnot. It's like, okay, there's reasons why I can understand that. But the guy who said this believed these things, so why don't you? Well, because he disagreed with them, so I'm free to disagree with him. And it's like, well, I guess that's the only logic by which you can say this. And that's the thing the joke says. It's like, we're massively in your debt for setting the example that anytime we disagree with the church, we can just start our own. It's like, that's sort of what
That's not even what he did.
No. I just imagine like there would be an awesome alternate history book where it's like Luther 400 years after the Great Schism was actually the true reformer who brought together East and West. This is my alternate fan fiction history.
He was also the beginner of the one who launched the Counter Reformation. Actually get all this done!
They actually wouldn't have needed a counter-reformation if the East and West had just reunited. Because essentially the thing that I'm listening to as I start... Because obviously that was a satire, but I listened to several other things talking about, like, these are what Luther believed. I was like, he sounds awfully Orthodox to me.
Yeah.
Did he know about the Orthodox Church? Was he in contact with them?
Is it still available?
Surely
I'm sorry. It just felt appropriate.
Well, seriously though, it's like, surely couldn't he have just been like, well, I guess I'll promote orthodoxy in the West.
I don't
could have had Western Orthodoxy.
I don't know that orthodoxy was quite...
They believe the same... I have yet to find something Luther was
suggesting.
No,
I was not saying that. I'm saying I don't know that it was...
Yes.
It was more of a fringe group at the time, yeah?
No, it was the dominant church of the East. Basically, everything past Turkey is Orthodox, even to this day.
Yes, but was that always the case?
Yes. The entirety of Christendom split in half. That's why it's called the Great Schism.
Well, yeah.
It wasn't like, Turkey was on its own. It's like, no, pretty much everything east of Rome was in agreement. That's why they had such issues with Rome. So I don't know. It's like, if that's my alternate history. For Luther was the true reformer who reunited East and West. Is he a saint in either tradition? I don't know. Seems like he should be.
I feel like he is.
I've never heard anyone call him
Saint Luther? That's a shame.
I've never heard
He's just Luther.
Well, why would the Catholics call him that?
I suppose.
The guy who undermined us.
Why not the guy who brought us to our senses?
Well, because they don't necessarily think that he did. Yes,
at this moment they probably would say that.
What? This is not... What? Martin Luther's 95 Theses make him a saint. That's not how sainthood works, pal.
You're
a Protestant, aren't you?
You're a Protestant. You're a Protestant, aren't you, Squidward?
Calling... Oh, okay, so maybe one of the popes canonized Martin Luther? Nope, doesn't seem to be.
What about within the Orthodox tradition? Do they...
I'm a little surprised that the answer isn't... like, I would have thought it would either say yes or no.
Is he, isn't he, will he, won't he answer yes or no?
The fact that it's not coming up suggests that it's probably not the case.
Yeah, that's sad. Well, there you go. Sorry,
Well,
Luther.
that's what would have happened in my history.
Everybody just
been
defecated on
It would
your...
have been the ultimate saint
On your...
who corrected both sides of the church. Anyways. Is this another video? It seems as though we were, because we stopped the other one right at the hour mark. Let's just clear the back catalog.
Yeah. That's...
I want you all to listen very closely to the
yes.
to the reticence in his... Yeah.
No, I
Angels.
thought we were gonna...
What about the Jews?
You are gonna have to qualify that.
Did you
for
watch
me.
the video?
I
That
watched
was
the
all the
video, and I have
qualification.
not at all, sir. No, you
'Cause it's
couple
basically-
things. You
well,
stated in a text.
I didn't send
to
you the
me,
Jewish video, that's true. I sent you the Orthodox opinions on angels.
No, you sent me that one guy that
Jonathan Pajot,
you
who's
thought
Orthodox.
was a little bit more.
He said many things that were sort of a combination of both of them.
and I think that's
where
true.
He takes
but there were
he takes a
certain
kind
things-
of archetypal.
But he didn't ever deny that angels have their own agency.
No, exactly. That's why I said he sort of fuses our ideas.
But that's only ever the problem I had with your...
He called them...
subtle bodies.
Well, no, yes, that's the term, but I'm saying he said... I thought he said some...
But that's only their
basically
ontological makeup.
Well, but he was
That's
essentially
all. And
saying
I
that
made
they
that
would...
argument.
But he's saying
you just
that
made it better.
They would be, therefore... This is going to sound very New Age, but it's the best because people don't know what archetypes are anymore. Effectively, the angels would be angels of mental states.
Yeah, virtues.
Where it's like in the moment when you find yourself either inspired to do some good deed or tempted by some wicked thought, you are in effect not necessarily being possessed because it's not overriding your will, but you are in communion with
or being affected by
an angel/demon of a very specific. This is the word I'm missing. Because he says he's saying that they have and they have a very uniquely specific. Like it isn't just the angel of kindness. It's like no, it would actually be very specified. It's like again, this is why I think archetypal. He never said that. Which
well,
I'm
and that's
a little
why
surprised.
there's archangel.
But it basically is like it's
archangels,
essentially just
and
the
then
angel of.
underneath that is
So and again, I made this argument. It's like this is why I think the Greek gods are unique, because they are probably the closest any pagan mythology has come to that level of archetypal clarity.
Well, but it's the. Okay, I'm going to leave it there.
No, I'm not suggesting. I'm saying
I agree with you, but
I understand
where
that
you
he
get
said
that,
at the
it's the
beginning.
men of renown.
What? What does that even mean?
It's.
You're going to have to explain what you mean by that if you expect me to...
Never mind. I want you to clarify your thought first, because I want to stay on topic.
This is the topic.
No, I don't want to bird walk, though, so just keep on.
I'm saying his opinion was essentially that they have... He was basically saying that they are, in that sense, archetypal personifications.
And I don't disagree, but he
of course takes the opinion that no, they do obviously exist.
Well, but then he also said they can both for the good, but they also can sin and walk away from that.
Yeah, and he did say
clarifies that.
He said that they have. Well, it was interesting that he said that, or rather, he was reading from one of the early because he probably
church fathers.
Well, he wouldn't have been a church father at that period because it was too late to be truly a father, but a respected theologian of his time, saying that they do have free will, but they also can't deviate from their metaphysical, like whatever they are, the patron angel of it's like baked into them. Well, so but they can't deny it.
They can deviate.
And
he said they
never
can
exactly
walk away from it as far as sin. He did say that they could, but basically that they couldn't. They weren't able to step outside of their given role to something else.
The worst they could do would then be
to just not do that.
Well, this, I
the
suppose,
antithesis
this would support the notion that there is no true evil, only good,
devoid of
only good used for its own for wicked ends.
Right. It's the.
How do you define that without getting into a logical
Well, and we've talked about this, but it's the idea of
it's disorder rather than, or it's chaos rather than order. Where it's like you have a function which you could misuse, but you still are being defined by the function, even by misusing it.
But what's interesting is that's literally the.
So you don't disagree with what I was saying? Is that he was sort of synthesizing the two notions.
He was, but I feel like
that he agreed with you and with me. And obviously he didn't fully agree with both of us because we came from different sides. My point is that's what I mean by synthesis.
Well, and I think where I don't take issue, I never took issue with the idea that on a physical level or even on a metaphysical level that they don't have physical makeup. That's people. Almost what. Yeah,
that's the difficulty.
I agree. They're not people.
But so they're personalities. Even person, I think, carries the connotation. I would say, I mean, again, as much as it sounds new agey, you'd say mental state. Or personality, I guess. Because even Jordan Peterson had a very fascinating conversation in which he basically said, the only if, and again, this is a sort of metaphysical assumption, which you have to make for these kinds of claims, if emotions exist as more than merely a materialist view of chemicals in the body, which... That's the metaphysical assumption, is that there is more than that. It's a form of mind-body dualism. It's like emotions must have some grip on the body.
Yeah, exactly.
What does that grip look like if you were to analyze it? It's like an emotion is a personality. You can tell when someone is angry because they act angry, which means the only thing we know about that can manifest physical form in a body is personality. Mm-hmm. Therefore, if an emotion takes over a person, it's effectively a personality that they are currently manifesting.
Right.
So this was basically what I was saying, is that they are, if they would be effectively these forms of mental state that are aimed at very specific kinds of thing. And this is actually
But how can those things have their own ability to either yield to their God-given design or sin against?
Well... This is why
that's the problem.
This is why the Jewish notion fascinates me.
Because
it kind of answers that, because it basically says angels and demons are these spirits, or again these personalities or mental states.
Well,
but they are fixed, as in they are what they are and they cannot change. They don't have free will. The Jews would in fact deny angels do not have free will, because free will is what makes man in the image of God. They state that explicitly. That's why
I'm gonna need you to,
because what else is we come down to what else is the image of God if it's not
on that.
I could send you the video.
I would like to listen to it, because anything I've ever read of the Jewish notion
Michael Knowles had a debate, because people tease him a lot because he renounced the concept of it's always demons. And it's become a bit of a joke.
But I mean,
so he actually was having a discussion with a Jewish theologian. It's like, okay, what are the differences between Catholic and Jewish notions of demons and angels and things?
The thing that because anything I've ever read, it's the whole Elohim concept, and most of that.
But see,
argues
those are Christian authors interpreting Jewish texts who come up with those arguments. No. The guy you mentioned was a Christian.
Well, yes, that's one person.
So this is a Jewish teacher, and I have heard more than one. I guess not all of them are Jewish teachers, but I've heard more than one Jewish person speaking on the issue state that Jewish religion really doesn't put much stock in angels and demons. It's like, yes, they exist. They aren't separate beings. They don't have free will.
They also don't put a lot of credence into statements like what Christ made, as far as the whole...
They don't put much credence in anything Christ
Well, no, but the idea that, if you've committed adultery in your heart, you've committed... Because remember, Prager did the whole discussion on that too, where he's like, essentially Jews focus more on the external, in that if it's not something that's been manifest externally, then it doesn't matter, essentially.
I would say he went further than that, because I would agree with the statement you just made, in that if you are tempted to do something and you don't do it, you've done nothing wrong.
And I don't disagree with that statement. My point is that Jesus was getting at the idea that man in their heart is evil and needs redemption. That's what he was identifying in that regard.
That's what he was saying in that statement.
The point was the Pharisees were highlighting themselves as pictures of virtue.
Yes, but they were also using, again, it's a matter of the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. They were saying, yes, we've adhered to these strict rules.
Right.
But not truly, because they were obviously, again, tying it all together, they were effectively sophistrizing their own rules by going, well, yes, I'm supposed to honor my father and mother, but I actually honor God instead of my father and mother, and that means I'm okay. And it's like, well, no, that's rules lawyering. You're basically saying, well, I'm using this other criteria to fill in for this criteria, which means I've met this criteria, and it's like, well, no, you haven't. So I feel like, if anything, Jesus was just cutting through that and going, no, it says what it says. Don't read in. Don't read different meanings.
But I...
It wasn't that they were simply, it's like, because again, how could you...
This particular point, I would like to listen to some of the
well, you should
content that
you... I didn't think to send it because
No, and that's fine. I'm not, like, bothered by that at all. I don't know that I fully adhere to the notion that the Jews wouldn't have understood angels and demons to exist, especially within their own...
They never deny their existence, but the guy
their own
at least did say that they don't have... Because his argument was that the concept of heavenly war that led to the fall of of demons was essentially like, that is a explicitly Christian notion that is not Jewish.
Well, and that's true.
Which is true. It's not in the Old Testament. It is... It's correct. Not even really in the New Testament, actually. It comes from...
Yeah, it's from John, but I think it's 2nd or 3rd John. But yeah, it's... I would agree, because even Heiser would agree with that sentiment. That's not the whole... Within that particular war on angels and demons level, that didn't occur that way, is what
the question
Heiser
that I think
says.
Must then be asked is... If free will is not what makes man in the image of God, then what is? Because it must be something that angels don't have.
Agreed, and that's what and that's
never
why
heard a satisfactory answer to that.
I don't know that I disagree in totality. I think that angels can bear parts of the image of God without. I think we represent different parts of the image of God.
Then why then would we do that? Why would God make half of a thing with his half of his image?
Well, I'm not specifically saying even half. I'm just saying different.
Or some percentage. It's like, if he was going to create a race of beings that were made, at least to some degree, in his image, it's like, why wouldn't he do it the full thing? What would be the purpose of them without that?
That is
I think if you make the argument, it's like, no, they are merely...
I have not specifically revisited this argument with you yet, because I do feel like I want to be able to flesh out and tease out the idea of what particularly identifies image of God in my theological opinion, because there is so much theology about that you can go in so many different directions, because you can start from one end and go, you can even be a fraction of a centimeter off on one side or the other, and it's like, it's going to lead you in completely different camps.
Yeah, but see, that's in some ways why I think free will is a very succinct and yet all-encompassing answer.
It is, but it's also, in my opinion, slightly reductive, because I think that it then inhibits you from seeing that there were times very clearly that angels did walk away from. That's an Old Testament scripture.
It's an interpretation of an Old Testament scripture. Not. It is, because you have never yet given me whatever the article written by that guy you keep referencing is, because you always redound. It's like, well, no, this is the interpretation, and you might say, well, it's in the Hebrew necessarily. But I go, well, then you're going to have to show me that, because I don't know that is inherently the case, because the phrase...
Understanding them as angels, or...
Any aspect of it. It's like, because one thing, in fact, this was even in the Exodus series, Dennis Prager says that despite the fact that the phrase Elohim is, technically speaking, a plural noun, anytime a verb accompanies it, it is a singular verb.
Sure.
Which means that Elohim was sort of one of those weird compound nouns, like fish or sheep, where it's like there is no plural. It is both plural and singular, and context determines.
Right.
And so anytime, quote, Elohim does something, it is a singular thing. So that the argument is the verb because Hebrew has tense.
But there are times that the context does not have those singular nouns.
He makes the claim, which again, I suppose if I were to be truly fair, what I would have to require just as much proof from him. But he made the claim that every time the word Elohim and a verb are included together, the verb is always singular, implying it is one being. Therefore, the only logical contextual analysis would be to say that the one being is God in this instance.
Yes, I think for the most part that is true.
If he's correct in that claim that it is universal, then I would say it means that
it's not universal. I think that it's a lion's share, certainly, because most of the time it's referring to a spirit that is not embodied. It is referring to God in the Old Testament. However, I will clarify that there are certainly passages within Psalms as well as I think in Daniel that refer to Elohim plural but don't give any particular, the verbiage would arguably then be plural as well. I don't know why he wouldn't have mentioned that. Well, yeah, and again, I would like to.
His claim is that it never is. Now, maybe he's wrong or maybe not. I don't know.
Well, it's possible he's not. I mean, I wouldn't specifically
all I'm saying is, I suppose this is the difficult thing I'm coming up against, is that there is far more certainty within a lot of the Jewish answers to these questions.
Only because...
And that is something where I go, I don't even necessarily agree with all the answers.
There is a placid and implacability almost to it, where it's like, yes, a bit.
That is the Jewish bordering on the anti-Semitic.
No.
The Jews just don't listen.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it is certainly true that they are so... previously, obviously, before it was even textual, it was an oral tradition, and
but here's the difficulty:
steeped in
if this interpretation is correct, which you are arguing, perhaps it's not, and it might be modern scholarship that says it. I don't know.
Sure,
but if it is the case, it's like no, this has been Jewish teaching forever. Then this would have been the teaching that Christ and the apostles knew.
Which
that if Jewish teaching states that angels and demons, yes, exist, but they are not separate personalities and are simply these sorts of spirit things, personality states, with no free will. Then, whenever Christ or the apostle references them amongst Jewish culture, they themselves would have known that this was the teaching and thus meant that, even though you could interpret New Testament scriptures to mean a Christian interpretation, they themselves, if this was the teaching, would have meant the other thing, which means you would have to demonstrate that this line of scholarship is divorced from ancient scholarship, which I think is a heavy task.
I don't know that you'd have... I would like to sharpen slightly... We're talking about angels and demons. Let's sharpen it a little bit further and say specifically with the notion of the devil or Satan.
Well, they would go so far as to say the devil is one of them.
But my point in that is... Okay, so what you're saying in that statement is that Christ somehow had some sort of internal dialogue with his own evil.
No, not his own evil, with the spirit of...
But that...
Because and I admit, this makes me go, okay, I don't know that I would want to accept this depth of question, or this depth of answer to the question. Because they went so far, and again, this is in line with Jewish thinking that I am aware of, to the degree that I'm aware of it, is that... Because again, Satan in Hebrew means adversary, which they're suggesting, and their interpretation would be that he is the sort of, I forget the word, and I'm not going to make up my own that's as good, but effectively it's a metaphysical foil to God set up under the boot heel of God eternally, so it's never that there was a struggle between them. Essentially, he is the adversary in that his job is, and again, they didn't go into this, it was a relatively short video, but the argument would be that in the sense of, again, the issue I have is that the argument makes a great deal of sense, which means that the conclusion, which I don't find comfortable, is nonetheless, I can't logically refute it. The argument is, if free will is what makes man in the image of God, then the option for evil necessarily must exist, because then only then can the option for good exist. And this is the whole reason why man must have free will in the beginning, is because if he does not, then he cannot be good, because good, in this sort of classical definition, is not merely the incapability of evil, but the choice of good over evil, which means you must have both choices and make the right choice.
Sure.
So, therefore, there must be something which opposes. In essence, what their interpretation is when they say the adversary is not God's adversary, it's man's adversary. And this sounds an awful lot like the book of Job, where it's like, how on earth could Satan go up to God and say, hey, let's make a bet about this guy? It's like, you'd think, in the Christian context, you'd think, how did he get in? What's this? Well, did this happen before the fall?
Allowed, I think, within...
Yeah, but I think that makes a lot of assumptions, where if it's just, no, he was just one of these sort of metaphysical spirit entities whose job was literally to tempt people so as to test their moral virtue.
But that then
that makes
God
the book of Job
some sort of and that to me calls into question God's motivations for, because what that essentially states is that God is putting into,
that God is allowing temptation for the sake of
not even allowing
personal...
though, because he's then not manufactured. He has set up this system in place in which that occurs. He's developed that. And you go,
I don't know that
God
that is, again, that's a fairly Jewish notion.
Evil, nor does he tempt anyone. You're going, that's... I mean, I don't know.
The problem is, I don't know that I want to accept that, but I do think that logically speaking, it's like, it makes a lot of biblical stories, especially Old Testament stories, make a good deal more sense, especially the book of Job, which is probably the most misunderstood book in the whole Bible. Where it's like, yeah, God allowed this because Job was a more righteous man for having faced this than having never faced it. And it's like, I can't argue with that line of logic that says if Job had never been tested in this way, he would never have reached the level of righteousness he did. So therefore, I mean, again, this even reinterprets the concept of all things shall work together for your good. It's like, yeah, that will only happen because it's not just that, oh, yes, we'll take this and isn't it unfortunate, but it can be made into something good. It's like, no, this is the only way to get the good. And that's where you go, that's a very hard, but I don't know so that I would say, I don't feel that it has to open the door to the concept of, well, then that would imply that God's not actually as good as we think. I can certainly see how
I'm not trying to say slippery slope
that.
Argument. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying
But again, the Jewish notion of God is much more like, I mean, after all, Israel, the name means we who struggle with God. It's a little bit, not adversarial, but a little like fictional at times. They're much more comfortable with being like, yeah, we're not always happy with the things God does, and we're going to tell him. And I'm like, there's an element of that level of faith that goes, yes, of course, he's God and we're still going to worship him anyways. But like, what the heck, dude? And I appreciate, there's an element of frankness that I kind of appreciate about that.
I don't have a problem with.
I just feel like this is probably the logical extent of that, to which I have no substantive rebuttal.
No, well, and I would like to have you at least send me the.
Well, I would have to send you multiple resources at this
point. Please do, because
the video from Michael Knowles really was quite cursory, unfortunately.
Sure, but I want
the Exodus series. Dennis Prager talks about this. In fact, I mean, this is sort of tangentially related.
I still haven't been able to.
But he talks about the fact that there was specifically a group of Jewish priests in a concentration camp who, in light of the Abrahamic covenant, said they convened whatever, there's a name for this kind of a religious inquisition, feels like a very loaded term, but I mean, it's the closest thing to what it was, where they basically said, we believe that God has reneged his part of the covenant by allowing this to happen to us. And the reason he brings the story up is he says they went through this whole thing. There is actually it's essentially a legal process where it's like God has a representative and the Jews collectively had a representative who argued like, what does the covenant say? What has happened and what are the implications? And they basically reached the point that at the end, and this was why he said this typifies Jewish culture and faith in that, is he went, They reached a conclusion. The judge said, given the evidence, we hold that God has failed in his covenant. And then there was a quiet pause, and then they went, okay, it's Friday. It's time to say the prayers. So they're basically going, yeah, we believe that God's probably screwed something up, but we're still going to fulfill the obligations because, of course, he's God. Simply because we don't understand this, it's like, well, okay.
Well,
we'll voice our concerns because he allows that.
Is one thing. That, to me, is more of a comfortable phrase than to say that somehow he's messed something up, because the issue is...
Yeah, that language is more inflammatory than I would...
Like, to say he's... I don't know. I mean, I just... that it calls into question God's moral, not superiority.
But see, that's where I'm not exactly sure that it has
surety.
I don't know that it has to. The example given, and again, this is a potentially touchy example, but he's essentially this was actually directly from the Michael Knowles video, so this would be included. Where he says, you imagine the idea that a father who's a king training his son in moral virtue and how to be a good leader and how to be a good man is teaching him about the concepts of chastity and fidelity and and being faithful to your wife. And so he then, after this conversation, hires a prostitute to try and seduce his son. And this was their analogy, going, this is the role, in their opinion, that quote unquote this adversary fulfills, and that it is not an adversary to God, but is an adversary to man. Because only by facing this temptation can the son prove himself to be of the integrity that he professes to have. And that is a very uncomfortable argument, but I don't know that I would you say in that instance, oh, the king is being unjust? It's like, I don't think you would say that. I think he's certainly
tempting his son. And that's all I'm just uncomfortable with that. No, I'm not saying it's wrong. That's why I want you to send me. But is he doing that,
or is he allowing it to happen? Because again, only through facing...
I suppose in the most clear sense, physically, he's not the one tempting his son.
Sure, but in a way, that's the argument. If good exists, evil must. There cannot be good without evil.
No, because the antithesis of that is true too, then.
Can I be? Well, it's like light and shadow. One must be predominant. And in that instance, light, there can be no shadow where light is present. In essence, light predominates shadow in that there can be no shadows without light.
But that suggests that there
can be light without shadows.
They're dependent on one another.
No, because you could have light without shadows. I suppose you could make the argument if you had a sufficiently lit room, which might blow holes in the analogy. That would sort of arguably be what heaven would be, is goodness without evil. That, again, that's a difficult concept because you're now talking about things that literally are prophesied that we'll never know.
To me is a bit of a yin-yang thing because you go...
It is, and I don't know that that's unrealistic.
No, but I mean, that is there totality in shadow then too? I mean, there can't be.
What does that mean, totality?
There wouldn't be an ability for pure... I suppose you'd call it that, pure evil in that capacity either. But that means that God then isn't purely good. You know what I mean?
Like, well, in the sense that there can be shadow can't exist without. I mean, again, I don't know that this analogy works terribly well, but essentially the argument is, I suppose you could say shadow can exist without light, in that a room with zero light in it is full of shadow. But the moment a single light is introduced, the shadow is gone.
Well, it disperses to a particular side of the room or whatever it may be.
Or if it's a sufficient light, it goes away completely.
Sure.
So, the argument would be that both might... Again, I'm not exactly sure how well the analogy works, but it's essentially good always eradicates evil, but evil cannot truly eradicate good.
Yes.
Because even a single light in a dark room casts out the shadows.
Yeah.
Whereas a single shadow in a light room does not cast out the light. I'm not. Yeah, I found it to be a very like, ooh, okay, that's a tough sell.
Yeah, I want you to be able to send me those, not because I want to further this discussion. I don't think I have any.
Oh, I certainly don't either. But I'm just saying that this now gives me a certain degree of like, okay, so halfway between the Jewish and the Orthodox perspective is probably where my original postulate falls, which is like.
Because what is the Orthodox perspective on that?
That guy is an Orthodox guy, so what he was promoting was the Orthodox opinion.
Huh. See, and that's where I would say I follow very much. Like, I'm comfortable with it. What he was saying, and you talked about synthesis there. I think yes, but to me it was just a more clarified version of what I was saying anyway, because you had stated for sure about the idea that they didn't have physical makeup. I postulated that if they don't have physical makeup, then the argument could be made that if they're merely archetypal structures, they may not originate. I don't know that he makes that argument.
He doesn't use the word archetypal, but the phrase, when he even said the example of the concept of a subtle body, an archetype would be one of them.
Yes,
which is that it is a means of communication without physical form. That's the most summarized version of the video you'd have to see, but it's
right. No, I saw and I watched.
But it's essentially an archetype. If you want to give more supremacy to his line of terminology, then you say an archetype is a subtle body, in the same way that he says a story is a subtle body.
Right, and he did say
that it is an immaterial object communicating a moral / psychological / metaphysical framework.
But he did make the statement that not all subtle bodies are demons or angels. He just said basically that is what.
Sure,
the framework would be,
but then he stated with those specifically. If you'll allow me to conflate the term subtle body with archetype, because archetype is a term I'm much more familiar with. I don't know. Say that what I mean by archetype is what he was saying, because that is what I mean by archetype. Because I actually would be, in the Jungian sense, I would elevate them to basically that level of analysis.
Sure,
they are the overarching of all overarching metaphysical, psychological. All of those structures. I feel like Jung even says that they are essentially that whole thing. Metaphysical, psychological, spiritual, every concept. Anytime you're communicating a idea without a physical form, you're using an archetype. Maybe that's more than what Jung said, I don't know. But then, anyways, if you were to allow me to co-opt the term and say that is what I mean when I say archetype, then if angels and demons are merely archetypes of very specific things which you can interact with and perhaps commune with, then you open the door at least to the notion that in a Freudian / Jungian sense, these archetypes dwell within you and you are merely interacting with those things, which may or may not even be part of you. In essence, the argument I said is, in fact, I even said, I won't even deny that they might exist external to a person, but the question is, could they exist because of humanity's archetypal facets? In essence, the argument would be, could the spirit of anger, because humans are creatures capable of anger, and there's a lot of us, and a lot of us are unchecked and unaligned, the unresolved spirit of anger latent within every person could manifest externally, and once it does so, take on its own shape. In essence, I'm not denying that they don't have a form and an existence apart from humanity, but they may not have always had that form. They may have, essentially I'm saying they're anthropogenic. Right. That they do exist external to mankind, but they are come from mankind.
But that means that man then is the author of angels / demons, not God. And I go,
that opens that door, which would I go that far? I'm not sure. Again, I was only postulating this as a thought.
Sure, no, and I'm not saying it. Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
But I don't know that enough.
The thing that's positive,
nothing in the Bible jumps out to me that goes, no, that would be incorrect. Now, maybe I obviously don't have a perfect memory of all the things in the Bible that might say, no, actually, if you reread it, this passage would directly deny that. But all the passages that have been directed to deny it, I'm like, well, it's not exactly denial as much as it is that wouldn't there's ways I think of like going, no, that actually, this interpretation doesn't inherently clash if viewed from this perspective. That is all I'm saying. And this would align somewhat more closely with the Jewish notion. They don't use terms like psychological archetype or subtle body or whatever. But if they don't have free will and are merely static forces of metaphysical ethic,
okay,
whatever terminology, again, insert the definition that he gave of subtle body, because it's, in essence, I'm co-opting it again. But if you make the only exception that they are not capable of free will and thus are fixed, then I don't think in the Jewish ends it would make any difference whether or not they are external or internal, or begin as internal and then manifest as external. Because in essence, what this does is basically say, does God create this, or did he in creating us, allow us to create this? In essence, it would be a way of saying, I guess, where I'm scapegoating humanity and saying, God gave us the permission to do this because he had to in order to give us free will. And if we were perfect beings, we never would have created these things, but because we had the option and are fallen, we did. Thus, it's not strictly speaking his fault. Am I tying myself in mental knots? Perhaps.
No, I'm not even... like, the thing I think that is interesting is what it can do on a positive level is if you think about Jesus being not only, having this conversation with the accuser in the desert, as well as what is it that he is coming to defeat. It is the evil that is present because of mankind. That's not a notion I go, that makes me uncomfortable. I actually think that works, and in fact suggests that, there's a rescue from yourself, essentially. That which separates us from God is innately in us, but I don't know, only because I don't think I've been able to think about some of these new additions to the discussion long enough to really wrap my head around what my thoughts would be on it. I don't know that I'm terribly in line with the Jewish notion that they don't have their own agency. I think I probably am more in line with the Orthodox position in that regard, but I would say it's not even the notion of how they present physically or metaphysically. In that sentiment, I don't have a problem with the whole subtle bodies thing. It's much as the sentiment that they are their own units, even if you want to call it they are their own entity. That maybe entity is a good word.
But entity does not imply agency.
But again, in the Orthodox perspective, to say they don't have to be persons per se, but they have their ability to either align within the image or within the will of God, or decline to do so, and therefore and in fact he makes this case angels/demons.
That video.
And he makes this case, in fact, specifically that the only difference for them is because they are eternal, non-physical beings, that their resignation to go against or to do something counter to what God has designed them to do is a eternal thing.
But see,
and he even actually said that in the video, and I was like,
that really.
But I thought that it made sense to me.
If they have agency, no, it doesn't make much sense to me, because if they have agency and so do we, why would their non-corporeality? That implies that physicality is what allows for absolution, which I don't think
it is.
What part of the Bible?
Yes.
No, because death isn't.
Death is
salvation is not dependent upon death, because there have been people who have not died.
That's true, but I think that is the vehicle in which God chose to save us in the garden. He brought death upon humanity because if we sinned in the garden and he left us in the garden with the tree of life, we would have been forever separated.
But see, why? What part of the Bible makes that case?
Because he can't be in the presence of sin.
But see, But if absolution is made through grace, why does death have to become involved? Because it doesn't in all cases.
Well, I mean,
in a
the
vanishingly,
case that I suppose
there have been at least, we know, 3 people who went straight to heaven without having to die. So, I mean, call it a statistical anomaly, but if you, especially because you are far more keen on insisting on biblical literalism than I am, then I would say, well, then you're going to have to explain them, because they didn't have to die, which means they must have either been equally without sin as Christ, which I think we would have to reject.
No, as of course.
Or that there was a method of absolution available to them that was sufficient.
Well, no.
And that though it was exceedingly difficult, they did manage it enough to achieve it.
And I think the only answer in that regard is that obviously God can do whatever the heck he wants. So if
but see, if that's the case, then what is all the rest of this matter?
Well, the why is...
Because in some ways, this is why the Jewish perspective, uncomfortable as it is, does make the book of Job make the absolute most sense it's ever made. Which is, Job is basically going... I guess it's true that God could do whatever he wants. And I have to just eat it.
But the one doesn't call God's morality into question, whereas the other does.
Well, Job certainly... If Job is taken literally, I think you would have to admit that it is very much... Then the only difference, if we go back to the king's analogy, is that rather than hiring the prostitute came to him and went, I'll test your son for you, and he allowed it. Which is the same thing, in my opinion.
It's not.
To say, well,
it's such a nuance, but
no,
it's not.
I would argue that it isn't. It's not the same. It is the same. There's the difference, which I can agree contextually. I don't think it has any moral weight at all, because by consenting to it, whether it was his idea or not, he condones it. And I think that is, you go, well, then it's the same difference is made.
Yeah, no, I understand.
So, again, you either have to say, well, the Book of Job is probably meant as a metaphysical drama, which apparently is actually, there's a reason to believe that might be the case. Or rather, not that the Jews don't believe the Book of Job is about a real person, but that the Book of Job that we have was likely a dramatization of the better-known story.
Right.
Because of its structure.
That part I don't think.
And that's where you go. So either you'd have to say, well, no, there was no such man, and that the Book of Job is merely a myth meant to communicate this precept.
Right.
Or, no, God communes with Satan and they get together and is like, hey, I have a bet about this guy, and that God condones. Because that, to me,
is equally
that
problematic.
opens up as just as much of a door.
It does.
And in fact, that not only opens up the door, but because the rest of the Christian framework is even more set up against it than the Jewish framework, it does far more damage to it. Because if the notion of...
Oh, like you're saying the minute that
because
the Book of Job is inserted, it's like, okay, this gives
therefore,
massive
if the Book of
shockwaves.
Job is taken literally, then it must take place after the fall, which means how did Satan get audience with God?
Well, I mean, outside of, again, God allowing for it.
Which would, again, be, if sin cannot be in the presence of God, then how could that even be allowed? Unless you're willing to say, well, God can do whatever he wants. At which point, you've basically already conceded the Jewish notion. That's where I'm saying, because all of this stuff that we have on top of the basic Jewish sort of much less restrictive framework.
Now, I said that before.
That book does more damage to that than it does to the Jewish, which is the Jewish book is basically, well, yeah, life sucks, but God ultimately has the transcendent authority. And he essentially, that is the only answer that comes at the end of Job, is God basically goes, can I not do what I want? Effectively, that's God's answer to Job.
Yeah.
And that's where you just have to go, you can, quite reasonably, look at that and go, well, I don't think I want anything to do with this. At which point you go, well, okay, you don't have to. But there is honor ascribed to Job for saying, despite that it makes me suffer personally, I have to accept the transcendent nature of this being. Yeah. And thus accept what happens to me, despite the fact that it doesn't make much logical sense. Now,
well, it's a resolution to, I wouldn't call it fate, but it's a resolution to what the reality that he's living in, because there's no sense in trying to fight against something at that point you're just punching the air, you know? It's like you're not going to be actually effective in resisting anything. In the same sense that...
Well, again, shake your stick at God all you want.
Right.
But it will have no effect and you will die basically going, well, I did nothing but spite. And even that spite meant nothing.
Right.
So, again, you can make that decision, but it is essentially a nihilistic decision.
Yeah.
So if you want to then spend both your life on Earth and eternity in nihilistic hell, Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead. At least with the Job option, you might say, well, I suffered on earth, but I will at least attain non-eternal hell. I had temporary hell, which I would take in the grand scheme. I'm not saying that now I'm professing Judaism, because certainly that's not the case. I would actually be very curious what the Messianic Jews believe, because I would imagine they must... They, of all people, would likely be... They would be least willing to cast out either side of...
Correct.
And that, therefore, they would... If anyone has found the unifying thread between Old Testament and New Testament depictions of God, which are not contradictory, but certainly
I don't think
seemingly confusing. Well, I wouldn't say contradictory, because that I don't think is possible.
But I mean, what parts of that I'm curious about? What parts about, because I've actually found
because the version of God in the Old Testament, if taken on its with no New Testament foundation, would sort of support a Jewish cynical view, which is like, God doesn't always make much sense, but he's God, so what can we do?
But he was a fulfiller of covenant repeatedly.
Well, sure, but that doesn't mean that life was going to be good.
Well, I mean,
nor does it mean that God doesn't allow bad things to happen.
Though? I mean,
essentially, the Jews have
things to happen.
Essentially, the Jews have the answer to why does God allow bad things to happen to good people. The answer is because he's God, because he can do that if he so chooses, and that does not negate his moral correctness. That is a very uncomfortable supposition, but this is one of the reasons why people joke about Jews being so cynical. It's like, I guess if this was your worldview, you would kind of be like, yeah, we think he's good, but life sure sucks sometimes.
Well, and that to me comes down to a lack of understanding on humans' parts than it does on...
Sure, but I think that they would admit that. We just go, we don't know how it's consistent, but we believe that it is.
Yeah.
So, for no other reason than because he's the transcendent being.
Right.
It's like, I'd rather be on his side than any other thing's side.
How is that different, though, than the New Testament?
Well, because as you said, the New Testament, that would seem to suggest a New Testament depiction of God would be far less, does not gel well with this Job-like conception of God, who literally not only must allow evil to happen because man has free will, but in fact seems to encourage testing of evil to bring out... It's like... That would do more damage to the sort of benevolent image of God that and I wouldn't even... I think
it's a culmination. He literally had to syncretize his justice.
The phrase "had to," it's like, does God have to do anything?
Well, of course, but it would have been out of his nature not to syncretize his justice with his mercy. And so, therefore, he literally sacrificed himself in effect to vanquish
the evil that he allowed in the world.
Correct.
Well, you're saying, that does seem to call into question his righteousness. I'm like, I don't deny that it gives ammo to those who would seek to do that. I don't think that it does or that it must on its own.
Right.
But I forgot what the actual origin. Why did I start with this concept of the Messianic Jews? It's like because they would have not allowed themselves to discard either side.
Right.
I imagine that if anyone has found a good explanation of both sides of it being synonymous, they would have done it. Because I do think that the Jews obviously deny all of the New Testament. And to a certain extent, I feel that at least there might be Christians who, in effect, deny the Old Testament.
No, they do, yeah.
Not certainly overtly, but kind of like
certainly in a Protestant context.
It doesn't matter anymore, which is like, no.
It's a shame.
Neither of us... Again, it's where I go, okay, we criticize the Jews for saying, you can't just deny... And if anything, though, I feel that the Jews are at least... internally consistent.
Yeah, that's true.
Christ certainly does pose quite a difficulty for our theology, so we just said, this doesn't seem to fit, so we're going to stick with what we know.
Sure.
It's internally consistent, and you'd say, that doesn't change that it's wrong, at least in the Christian view. Mm-hmm. But I think it's far worse on the Christian side to trick yourself into sort of going, the Old Testament's old and it doesn't matter anymore.
Which, or I've heard people even say it's actually not applicable anymore because we have the New Covenant. I'm like, no, you're very wrong.
The apostles would have denied that completely. So that's where I go, I think at least the Jews are overt and consistent about what they're cutting out, rather than saying, "Well, we're not really cutting it out."
What a surprise!
We just don't ever
Christians
teach
not being
it,
consistent,
and we don't.
It's the Protestants' fault again.
No, because the Catholics did have things wrong. I mean,
No,
the Reformation
I'm joking,
needed to
obviously.
happen, but it should have been a Reformation, not a protest.
Yeah.
It was not intended as protest; it was intended as Reformation. Anyways, that's just another thing.